Sometimes I start out on a video like this with a pretty clear idea of where I think it's going to go. At the same time, I worry that that's going to make the results predictable and therefore the video not worth watching. In both cases for this video, I couldn't have been more wrong. $4,000 is a lot to spend on a headphone. So is $4,500 or even $5,000. By the time you get to spending $8,000 US or even more, things are getting seriously expensive. So how can you choose? And how might the amplifier you're using influence that decision? I've said before that there is no perfect headphone, and that's still true even when the headphones can cost as much as half the price of a new small car. What that means for us is that we need to choose our headphones carefully, especially when you're dropping the equivalent to the quarterly GDP of a small country on some of these. And so let's go on a journey through a range of musical genres so I can tell you where each of these headphones has its strengths and its weaknesses, where they excel and where they struggle. You'll find that each headphone has its moment in the sun here, some more than others. But I wasn't pulling any punches here, and I wasn't being deliberately even-handed. Every headphone had to earn its wins, as you'll see. One more thing before we get rolling is that I realise there are some headphones missing. There's no Final Audio D8000, no DCA Expanse, and no ZMF Caldera. I did my best to get as many flagships in one place at the same time as I could, but I couldn't get all of them. And so now let's start with the most general category of all. I made a couple of decisions as I started out the testing process. My first decision was to bring together 3 amplifiers to test with. In the Enlium AMP23R, the Burst & Soloist Voyager, and also the Linear Tube Audio MZ3 with upgraded tubes in the form of the Ray Tubes 12AT7 Select and the Ray 6SN7 Reserve tubes. We'll come back to that decision in a minute. The second decision I made was to group certain genres together based on their characteristics. It would have taken forever to test and discuss all of the major musical genres. And so I've clustered together genres that I think require similar types of performance from a headphone to sound their best. And we're going to start with the biggest cluster of all, which is music like rock, blues, folk, country, independent, and alternative. And the reason that all of these are together is they all have similar combinations of instruments and generally are going to be best with the same sorts of headphones. In other words, a headphone that can produce electric guitar or acoustic guitar effectively, along with electrified bass, drums, vocals, and maybe piano or keyboard. These genres are also going to sound best from a headphone that presents natural staging with good separation in space. And so ultimately we're looking for headphones that can produce the most lifelike or live-like sound. I kicked testing off by moving each of the headphones through the 3 amps that I'd selected for this test. And that was to see if the amplifiers were significantly influencing the sound of each headphone. I did not expect the results. Firstly, I found that my choice of amp did not change my preferences and feelings about the performance of each headphone on the various genres. More surprising though, was that the tube amp, the Linear Tube Audio MZ3 with upgraded tubes, was easily my favourite amp across all 6 headphones. And that's including the reputedly difficult to drive Abyss 1266. The MZ3 comfortably drove the 1266s at about 65% volume, and it sounded magnificent while doing it. Of course, each amplifier did bring its own character to the sound, and I would lean towards certain amplifiers for certain headphones, and so I might lean towards the Voyager for a brighter, slightly more energetic headphone, because the Voyager's got a slightly more refined and smoother sound to it, whereas the MZ3 or the AMP23R might help to bring to life a headphone that's already a bit richer and smoother. But all of this was preferential and not a necessity to get any of the headphones to perform better or worse. In other words, I still had the same feelings and preferences of any headphone, regardless of which amplifier it was with. Having headphone A on amplifier 1 and having headphone B on amplifier 2 didn't change how a headphone A and headphone B compared with one another. Kicking off with the Abyss 1266 on tracks like Rainmaker by Kev Mo, the imaging was clean and well focused, but the vocals did sound a little bit off from a tonal perspective. Where the 1266s really shone though was a sense of bass clarity and texture. They're amazing in that regard. They deliver tactile and punchy bass in genres like this, and they're incredibly enjoyable as a result. Interestingly, moving the 1266s over to the Linear Tube Audio MZ3 actually increased the sense of bass weight, but it also made it just a little bit less tight and punchy. On balance, I think it was actually an excellent sound though, and if I owned the 1266s, which I don't, they've been lent to me, I would probably use them most of the time on the MZ3. It's just a wonderful pairing, despite what you might sometimes hear about planers not going well with tubes. That's complete rubbish, it's not true, you just need to understand the actual pairings of them. Swapping from the 1266s to the HEADPHONE Susvara Unveiled revealed more texture, detail and resolution via the Susvaras. I could hear more nuance in the music, and textures in instruments like horns were clearer from the Susvaras. The soundstage also becomes a bit wider from the Susvaras, but it's flatter than the 1266s. Unfortunately, the bass also drops away a fair bit with the Susvaras compared to the 1266s, and it made the Susvaras less enjoyable overall to me. But that's not to say that the Susvara Unveiled lacks feel. They actually have a great sense of articulation and feel at all frequencies. They just don't have a lot of weight and presence behind it. Separation and clarity were amazing from these, and that's really where their strengths lie. I also feel like they were a bit more natural sounding, particularly on full range instruments like piano, where you had a consistent tonality all the way from the bottom of the range through to the top, whereas the 1266s can be a little bit uneven there. And at this point, it was actually hard for me to choose whether I preferred the Unveiled or the 1266s. And as I thought more about it, it was the 1266s I would want to reach for more often, and so they get the early lead. The next headphone I reached for were the Yamaha YH5000 SEs, and this was the first time I'd spent any significant time listening to the Yamahas. I've got a full review coming though, of course, so make sure you subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss out on the review of this one. Listening to the YH5000s on this collection of mainstream genres showed a tonality that's just a little bit off natural to my ears, but it's in a different way to the 1266s. The YH5000s put just a little bit too much energy into the upper mid-range for my tastes, but they do offset it with some excellent bass. The bass from the YH5000s is less than the 1266s, but it's more than the Susvara Unveiled. It's also solid and punchy. They deliver excellent clarity and detail, maybe not quite Susvara level, but very close, and it's all delivered in a wonderfully shaped and sized soundstage. It's not a huge soundstage necessarily, but it's very well defined and each instrument is perfectly placed. And in fact, if not for the slightly unnatural tonality of the YH5000s, they would have been running away with it at this stage. And that's where they did benefit a little bit from the smoother and more refined sound of the Burson Voyager headphone amp. But as I said before, no change of amp was enough to shift the final rankings of any of these headphones. So they're preferable on the Voyager, but it doesn't launch them into a clear lead. However, despite not having a clear lead, the YH5000s were so far my favourite headphone on these genres. And that's thanks to their overall balance of clarity, soundstage presentation, separation, and the balance of bass weight and detail retrieval. Next up, Falco Utopia 2022 version. Coming from the YH5000s, the Utopias initially sounded very, very wrong. But that was only for a minute until my brain recalibrated. In reality, the Utopias sound undeniably right on this type of genre. They have amazing balance of bass, mid-range and treble, combined with outstanding separation of sounds. Admittedly, they can tiptoe the line of being just a little bit spicy in the treble on some tracks depending on the mix of the track, but I don't find that they ever quite step over that line for my ears. Overall, they're just an incredibly enjoyable headphone that was now my current leader for this cluster of genres. But I would say that it's still by only a small margin over the YH5000s and the Abyss 1266. The LCD5s were up next from Audeze, and these also sounded wrong after coming from the Utopias. And there's a lesson in this. Be careful to always let your ears and brain recalibrate before making up your mind on the tonality of any headphone. Our brains adjust how we hear to suit the headphones or speakers that we're listening to. And so if you've gotten used to the sound from a certain source chain, maybe it's your normal go-to reference source chain, and then you try something else, particularly something like a headphone or a speaker that's going to have vastly different coloration, it could sound quite wrong at first if it's a bit different to what you're used to. Failing to give yourself time to recalibrate and adjust could prevent you from enjoying some incredibly fabulous sound. And that's true for sure with the LCD5s coming from the Utopias. The LCD5s delivered wonderful clarity and separation at all frequencies on all these genres. The LCD5s have the most fluid and natural delivery of any of these headphones alongside the 1266s. And what I mean there is that's in terms of things like feel, or the ability to actually feel the music. The staging and image is also more natural. They're just a very lifelike sounding headphone. And then in terms of tonality, I think they're a bit more natural than the 1266s, so they edge ahead of the 1266s for me. With the LCD5s on these particular genres, it's like each instrument is inside my head or just outside my head, but they feel real and tangible. Admittedly though, the bass from the LCD5s does lack some presence. The sense of impact and speed is excellent though. And I think that bass weight, or the lack of bass weight, is the price we pay for the insane clarity, insight and nuance that the LCD5s deliver throughout the rest of the spectrum. And so this was getting a bit tricky. I was having a really hard time deciding on a clear winner here. And so I decided to suspend my decision until I got to the Meza Elites. And they made my decision easy. The moment I listened to the Elites across a few tracks in these genres, it was clear that these were my favourite. They deliver bass weight to match the 1266s, tonality to match the Utopias, and an excellent sense of clarity as well, even though they fall short of the LCD5s or the Susvaras on maximum detail and resolution. It's not a huge shortfall in terms of detail and resolution, but the LCD5s and the Susvara Unveiled still hold the edge there. However, to my ears, my preferences, and across any of the three amplifiers, the Elites were consistently the most enjoyable headphone on these genres. And so as a reminder, that's really any genre that's using a combination of acoustic and or amplified guitars or electric guitars, bass, piano or keyboard, drums and vocals. That is except for hard rock and metal. We'll get to that soon. But first, let's talk electronic music. And now that we've covered some of the general strengths and weaknesses of each of these flagship headphones, we'll start to move a little bit faster through each of them. I'll only talk about the details and specifics where it's particularly relevant to understanding their performance. For the sake of this video, I considered electronic music to be any sort of music produced largely with electronically created sounds and or sampled audio, and that also relies more on the melodies and the instruments rather than strong leading vocals. In other words, it includes club, dance, dubstep, trance, electronic, and similar genres. If you're not familiar with these genres, one of my main reference tracks you can take a listen to was Nevermind by Infected Mushroom. Starting with the Elites, the staging and placement of sounds was excellent. The bass was solid, but I suspected other headphones in this group would have bass that had tighter punch, impact, and sense of impulse. And I was correct. Overall though, the feel from the Elites was very good and they made a very strong start. Swapping to the YH5000s had me immediately taking them off again. Not because they were bad to listen to, but I thought that I'd accidentally switched on my speakers at the same time. The staging and imaging from these was crazy. The bass from them also has excellent depth, but it did lack some weight and body to really drive home the feel of this sort of music. As I spent more time with the YH5000s, they were really beginning to grow on me, and I'm definitely excited for the full review of them, but for now, the Elites did still hold the lead. And that continued with the LCD5s that were up next. Surprisingly, the LCD5s delivered more mid-bass weight than the YH5000s did, but they lacked the depth or extension to deliver the really deepest notes of electronic music, and that's very important in this genre. I did find that the LCD5s got closer to the enjoyment levels that I had with the Elites, but their comparative lack of bass was their undoing, despite amazing image placement and sound staging overall. The Susvara Unveiled are up next, and they immediately impressed with their speed, clarity and detail. But I was also impressed and surprised by their sense of feel, particularly in the bass. The Susvara Unveiled don't have a lot of weight to the bass, but you feel the movement of air and you get a sense of the energy in the music as a result. I actually feel like the Unveiled drew level with the YH5000s here. They were slightly better than the YH5000s in terms of their bass delivery here, but they did fall a bit short of the YH5000s in terms of that out-of-head experience that made the YH5000s so fun. And so the Susvaras went back on the stand, and the 1266s came up next. and I honestly expected these to ace this genre. What I didn't expect was how visceral, brutal and exciting these would be. I think the 1266s might actually deliver a little bit too much energy for me on these genres, but you can tame them just a little bit with the choice of an amplifier like the Burson Voyager, which will just take a little bit of the edge off their attack, not their treble, but their sense of attack and energy and impulse. In other words, with the Voyager, it gets just a little tiny bit more polite. The 1266s didn't quite give me the same around the head presentation that the YH5000s did. That surprised me a little bit, but the left-right separation of sounds and the imaging and placement within the soundstage was still outstanding for the 1266s. And so for a combination of visceral feel and spatial excitement, the 1266s were a comfortable winner at this point in this comparison. But I don't know that I would call them my personal favourite. And neither were the Focal Utopias that came up next. On electronic genres, I actually found the Focal Utopias to be a little bit underwhelming amongst this competition. And it's probably worth clarifying here that any and all of these headphones are amazing. If you could own just one of these headphones as your one and only headphone, I don't think anybody's going to complain about having any of these as your one and only. They're all amazing. But the point is, when contrasted against one another, each of them has their own strengths and weaknesses. And therefore for different genres and different preferences, each of these will have its time in the sun. And so while the Utopias had good bass punch and feel, I felt that they lacked a sense of tactility that some of the other headphones here delivered. And that's particularly true more so in the upper registers, through the mid-range and the high frequency. It left the Utopias sounding good, but not great within this collection. And so I do think the 1266s are the best option on electronic music for those seeking that club-like experience, where you can feel the music, where you get the energy of the music coming through your ears and through your head, even at safe volume levels. But for my tastes, I still would slightly prefer the Meza Elites. So if you're looking for a little bit more of a laid-back presentation of electronic genres, I think the Elites are brilliant. If you're looking for that feel and that sense of excitement, the 1266s are going to be unbeatable. And that brings us now to probably the hardest genre for me to assess for you. And that's because it's not a category that I listen to regularly. The category is hard rock and metal. I am a fan of some older hard rock or even metal bands like Metallica, Black Sabbath, Motley Crue, etc. But I'm not really into the fast kick bass work and guttural vocals that define a lot of the more modern metal music. However, it was important to me to test all of these headphones on this type of music because it requires a very different skill set from these headphones than any other music in this roundup. Kicking off with the LCD5s, and they didn't disappoint with their sense of detail and speed. They were great for the sense of attack on guitars, the energy of drums, and keeping the busier passages within these genres well separated and clearly defined. However, I also kept wanting to hear a bit more weight and presence to the sound to drive home the authority, the energy, and the presence from the music. Likewise, the Susvara Unveiled also delivered insane levels of detail, speed, and clarity, but lacked weight for the emotion and the drive of the music. With the Unveils, I also felt like the vocals on Master of Puppets sounded just a little bit recessed, a little bit distant and less present, and therefore they lacked weight and authority on what should be powerful and authoritative vocal performances. Swapping to the Elites brought forth a better sense of weight and presence in the vocals, as you'd probably expect from what we've talked about so far, but they lost out on the sense of energy and clarity that's so important in this genre and that we've heard from the other headphones so far. And I started to wonder at this point if all these flagship headphones are actually too polite to get the most out of the metal genre. Enter the visceral and dynamic 1266s, which ended up being surprisingly less enjoyable on this genre than I expected, and that was due to overemphasized cymbals and snares due to their tonal response. That overemphasis distracted me from the vocals and left the overall tonal balance of the music just a little bit off from the 1266s. What I also found was that the bass impact from the 1266s occurs a little bit low in their register, and so it doesn't actually help as much on genres like metal, where it's more kick basses that are up in the mid-bass range rather than that really deep bass that was so great in the electronic genres. The Focal Utopias were up next, and surprisingly stole the show. They delivered excellent weight and punch in the bass, as well as fantastic clarity and attack from the guitars. The Utopias presented a complete musical picture and experience. This was definitely not how I expected this genre to unfold, but I also wasn't done yet. The YH5000s from Yamaha rounded out the field and took me by surprise. They were just a little bit splashy on the cymbals, and again a touch too forward in the upper mids on these genres, but they struck a tonal and technical balance that was second only to the Utopias on this set of genres. However, while we're talking about technicalities, I do feel like the YH5000s fell just a tiny little bit short of headphones like the LCD5s and the Utopias on the metal genre. Despite showing some excellent technical capabilities on the previous rounds, for some reason with metal, they didn't quite match up to the Utopias or the LCD5s on the metal genre. And so on the busy and fast passages of some of the metal tracks, it was the Utopias that maintained the lead. Jazz was up next, and I kept it separate from the earlier groupings because of the emphasis in jazz on the timbre of trumpets, saxophones, double bass and the like. All instruments that you don't tend to hear consistently in genres like blues, folk, alternative, independent, etc. The Utopias got first dibs on the jazz tests, and they led the way with an expectedly fantastic sound. The Elites then followed and also sounded excellent. The Elites focused my attention on different sounds in the mix, sounds that were a bit lower, like some of the lower horns like a trombone, more so than a high trumpet. But both headphones were very enjoyable, and I really enjoyed the Elites because they were just a touch more laid back, a touch more relaxed to listen to. And that could be the perfect answer for many of you, but both headphones are excellent for jazz. In particular, there's a trumpet solo at about the 1 minute 50 mark in Hot Pot, and that sounded fantastic from the Elites. The Abyss 1266 came up next, and it was surprisingly subdued in some of the frequencies. For example, the opening snare in Hot Pot, which is already a little bit recessed within the mix, was actually very recessed from the 1266s. And then at other times, there were certain sounds that were too forward from the 1266. And so again, the 1266's slightly unusual tuning did bring them undone from time to time in the jazz genre. Still talking about the track Hot Pot, and there are some high clarinets that start to come into the mix at about the 1 minute mark, and they sounded harsh and screechy from the 1266s. So much so that I initially thought they were trumpets playing because the sound wasn't as smooth as a high frequency clarinet should sound. Now I've said already that all of these headphones are amazing, and generally speaking they are, but the 1266 was actually unenjoyable on this track because of those clarinets, and that's a part of the frequency response of the 1266s. Now if you're not into jazz, that's probably irrelevant, but if jazz is a staple of your music collection, the 1266s might not be the best choice, or at least they might not be the best choice as your one and only headphone. The LCD5s once again came in delivering fantastic insight and detail into the music, as well as a spectacular sense of focus on each sound in the space. But I once again found that their tonal balance fell a bit short of the Utopias and the Elites on the jazz tracks, and they also nearly came undone alongside the 1266s on those clarinets in Hot Pot. The LCD5s just scraped through without me considering them unenjoyable, but it seems that I've happened upon a track that highlights select frequencies that can be the Achilles heel of some of these headphones. As I reached for the YH5000s, I wondered if this was when they'd steal a win, and they opened strongly with an excellent tonal balance. However, those high frequency sounds once again came out to ruin things. And I think the YH5000s were actually more uncomfortable with those clarinets than the 1266s were. Overall, I think the YH5000s are a bit more balanced, tonally speaking, but when they did go wrong, they went more wrong. And so the YH5000s weren't my cup of tea for jazz. And that left the Elites and the Utopias as the two that I was most preferring. And I was starting to think of how I would split the decision between the Utopias and the Elites. And ideally, I think you'd say that if you want a slightly crisper, more detailed sound, a more energetic sound, then the Utopias would be the go-to. However, if you want your jazz a bit more laid back, a little bit easier to listen to, then that's where the Elites would come in. Except, I'd forgotten the Unveileds. And they sounded magnificent. Their tonal balance and separation are both wonderful on these types of tracks. I would have liked a little bit more depth and layering in the soundstage, but the listening experience was undeniably excellent regardless. Those pesky clarinets by now had become my go-to test piece, along with some other tracks of course, and they were definitely bright from the Susvara Unveiled, but they weren't nasty. And so I was left with a very tough call. The Susvara Unveiled won on clarity and detail for jazz. The Elites were still strong for their smoothness and their easy and relaxed delivery of jazz. The Utopias sat somewhere in the middle and sort of balanced the difference. But I can't stress enough just how remarkable the Susvaras were for their technical prowess on these tracks. As an example, the speed and the clarity on the transients of the quick trumpet blasts at around about 2 minutes in Hot Pot was just amazing to listen to from the Susvaras. It was like standing next to the trumpeter, hearing it live in the live venue as they played it. And so I'm going to give the Unveiled a very slight edge for the jazz genre, but the Utopias and the Elites might be better for some people. And now we're getting there, not far to go. Thanks for sticking with me, and I hope this video has been as interesting and surprising for you as the testing process was for me. Orchestral music was next, and that's to encapsulate things like film scores and classical music. The YH5000s led us off with a wonderful sense of clarity and space in the sound. From the Yamahas, the orchestra had texture and clarity, but it sounded like one giant instrument in the best possible way. However, I did find that the piano in Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto in D minor, opus number 3, sounded sometimes just a little bit harsh and a little bit attacking from the YH5000s. And at the same time, the overall sound of the YH5000s could come across just a little bit delicate sometimes, as in lacking authority, body and weight. It was very enjoyable, but I was curious to see how the Yamahas were going to stack up against the rest of the competition. Initially, the LCD5s sounded perfect. Highly articulate, detailed, and with excellent tonal balance for their genres. Their sense of space and separation also worked wonderfully, but as testing continued, once again, I wanted the orchestra to have a bit more weight, body, and presence to its sound. I did feel like the LCD5s managed the high notes a little bit better than the YH5000s. They were still bright but not piercing, but the LCD5s just lacked weight and drama for my tastes. And that's an area that we know that the Elites shine. They brought weight and body to the lower registers, and I could feel the lower stringed instruments or the larger stringed instruments more from the Elites. However, everything was just a little bit smoother and with a bit less sense of articulation from the Elites. That could be good or not good depending on your tastes. So far the Elites were clearly my favourite listen, but we still had a fair way to go. The Utopias were again unsurprisingly brilliant, and by this point seemed to be the headphone that was the one to beat in any of these tests. They delivered more attack and energy than the Elites, but with the right amount of weight and body for the lower strings. At this point, it looked like they were in for another victory. The 1266s started off clean and crisp, and with an excellent sense of space for the orchestra to work in, and their tonal balance also worked really well on the classical test tracks I'd selected. However, I started to notice that some passages felt a bit disembodied or a little bit incoherent, or perhaps split apart is a better term, and it depended a lot on which specific instruments were playing and the frequencies that they were playing at. For example, in the Rachmaninoff Piano Concerto, there's some strings that play at about the 1:11 mark, and it sounded like they were playing either in a separate room or all off in their own, sitting in their own group off to the side of the stage. They felt and sounded completely separate from the rest of the orchestra. It made for an interesting listen, but perhaps a less authentic one. And so tonally and technically, the 1266s were very enjoyable, but they missed out on the win here because of that unusual spatial presentation. A headphone that didn't miss the mark was the Susvara Unveiled. These sounded marvellous. Speed, clarity, tonality, it was all perfect. They had a lovely balance of weight and clarity across all frequencies, as well as excellent management of those high notes that I mentioned before as potentially being too sharp on some of the headphones. They did everything as well as any other headphone here, and some of them they did better. And so the Unveiled is the easy winner for orchestral genres. And so next up, I tested genres that I lumped together into a category I'm calling radio pop. Basically, music that is mixed and mastered for playback on the radio, or maybe via streaming services like Spotify, where sound quality isn't always the top priority. The things I do for you. Vocals from the Unveiled can be a little bit forward on music in this type of genre, but I'd say the tonal balance was quite good and the bass was solid. However, the overall sound got a little bit fatiguing from the Unveiled, and that's especially on sampled beats and similar sounds like those in Lifetimes. The YH5000 was up next, and it was due for a win, but it would have to earn it. Luckily for it, it was surprisingly enjoyable, not as harsh on those beats as I would have expected, and with excellent bass quantity and quality. I also found that the upper mid-range, which can be a little bit too forward on some tracks, was working really well on these genres from the YH5000. It did very occasionally get just a little bit fatiguing, but at the same time, I think most headphones will get fatiguing on this type of music, good headphones anyway. Overall, the YH5000s impressed me with their sense of clarity, speed, space, imaging, bass, everything really. The Utopias were solid, but they did get fatiguing, and I found myself preferring the tonal balance of the YH5000s. Interestingly as well, the Utopias sometimes lack the bass weight and punch on these type of genres compared to something like the YH5000s. But the Utopias did place things like vocals and other instruments really nicely within the mix. If it hadn't been for the fatigue factor, they would have been a strong contender. The LCD5s were also not particularly enjoyable on these tracks. I think for this sort of music they're actually too revealing, and they don't have enough bass to help to round off and smooth off the presentation of this type of music. Of course, clarity and separation was amazing from the Audisies as always, and they sometimes sounded wonderful on these tracks, but at other times, less enjoyable. I couldn't actually work out what was going on with the changing enjoyment of the LCD5s. As I said, in one moment they could sound great, in another moment they'd be almost unenjoyable. Not quite, but getting towards it. And I can only assume or wonder if it's the amount of compression being used at any point in the music, because sometimes on quiet passages or very busy passages, the LCD5s were less enjoyable, but in the middle, they were kind of fine. I don't know, it was interesting. All that matters is the LCD5s were not going to win this one. As for the Elites, they would have won this category, if not for their emphasis in the upper treble. These tended to overdo certain sounds such as hi-hats, and it could make things really distracting and unnatural sounding. The bass from the Elites is excellent, and it helped to counteract any sense of harshness or fatigue, but that tonality that skews into the upper treble just killed these a little bit on this genre. And so, the YH5000s held on to be the unexpected winner of the radio pop category. That might sound like a dubious honour, but as I said earlier, the more time I've spent with the Yamahas, the more I'm enjoying them, and I'm really looking forward to that review. And so let's wrap up now with one last category that was wisely suggested by channel Patreon member Mark, and that category is general media consumption, which includes watching some YouTube videos and Netflix to see if any of these headphones stand out as clear winners or clear options to avoid. On YouTube, the Elites were fine, and the LCD5s were fine too. But I did find myself hearing more issues with the audio with the LCD5s. It didn't make them unenjoyable, but you're going to know in a hurry using the LCD5s if the YouTube content creator has their audio game on point or not. The Abyss 1266s were flat out awesome on YouTube. It sounded like the voice of presenters was coming from a set of speakers rather than through a set of headphones. The Utopias were also excellent, but they couldn't match the sense of space from the 1266s. And then the YH5000s were just a little bit harsh on the sibilant sounds. That's just in comparison to the rest. They weren't bad by any stretch, they weren't a problem, but out of all of them, they were the one that was the least enjoyable on YouTube. And then finally, the Susvara Unveiled was delivering insane levels of detail and clarity once again. I was hearing little sounds in the mix that I didn't hear from any of the other headphones. It's neither good or bad, it was just really interesting. They were fine, they were perfectly enjoyable and easy enough to listen to, and interesting if you want to hear all those details. And so ultimately for YouTube, every single one of these is complete overkill, but they're also all completely usable. On Netflix though, with more produced and cinematic style content, things started to separate a bit more. The Unveiled was once again visceral on detail, maybe too detailed. It felt like the Unveileds were over separating everything. They had me noticing sounds all around the soundscape and had me noticing the sounds more than focusing on the story that was unfolding on screen. In contrast, the LCD5s balanced detail and clarity with coherency. They were very enjoyable and you could easily forget that you were wearing them. However, depending on the content you're watching, they might lack some bass and rumble for some people. The Utopias sounded expectedly excellent, And the 1266s once again sounded like I was watching with a pair of speakers rather than a pair of headphones. The Yamaha YH5000s were once again good, but they also had a slight overemphasis on the dialogue at times, and that could be great if you want to really focus in on the dialogue, but it could make it just a little bit distracting and a little bit less natural. It's one of those things you'll adjust to in time, not a reason to avoid the YH5000s, but they might not be my first choice here. And then finally, the Mesa Elites struck a really nice balance across the board again. They had plenty of detail without overemphasizing it, and they deliver enough bass to sound big when you need it for explosions or other types of drama. And so for me, the Elites are the ones that I would reach for content consumption, but many of these are excellent and none of them are bad. And so, there you have it. 6 brilliant flagship headphones that all have their strengths and all have their weaknesses. Hopefully this has helped you work out which one might be the right one for you based on the genres you listen to more and your sonic preferences while listening to those genres. If you disagree with me about how you like a genre to sound, that's totally okay. Hopefully you've been able to read between the lines a bit. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you can check out the Yamaha YH5000 video when it drops. And maybe in the meantime, check out my video up here of the Focal Utopias to see why I think they're probably the best overall across the board flagship headphone you can buy. For now, I want to say a huge thanks to YouTube channel members, to channel Patreon members, and to those of you that leave super thanks on YouTube for videos like this one. Until next time, happy listening, be kind to each other, and I'll see you here again soon on Passion for Sound.